Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is slated to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin today as the U.S. and Ukraine seek the Kremlin's agreement on a new 30-day ceasefire proposal secured Tuesday in Saudi Arabia. Now, we discussed that proposal shortly after the news broke on Tuesday afternoon, but Secretary Rubio shed more light on the process Wednesday morning at a stop in Ireland. Let's listen.
As far as the Russian reaction to it, that's really the question here. And that is, this was a few hours old. We're going to bring it to them directly. We're going to say that Ukraine is prepared to stop all battlefield activity and begin the immediate process of negotiating an enduring end to the war. And we'll see what the response is. If their response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If their response is no, it would be highly unfortunate and it would make their intentions clear. So that's what we're hoping to hear from them. And obviously, as I said, that this was not prearranged for them. So they're probably processing the news the same as the rest of the world is. So we hope to have a positive answer from them. The ball is truly in their court.
European Union leaders are backing the proposal, though one report on Wednesday said, quote, a senior Russian source told Reuters that Putin would find it hard to agree to the ceasefire idea without hashing out terms and getting some sort of guarantees. That source also suggested the reason is because Putin is, and again, this is a Russian source, making advances on the battlefield. Is this the beginning of the end? How does one reflect on the historic Oval Office dust-up between Trump, Volodymyr Zelensky, and J.D. Vance, now that it looks like a ceasefire has been secured between Ukraine and the United States? At least the proposal has been secured between the United States and Ukraine. George Beebe is the director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute. He was director of the CIA's Russia analysis and director of the CIA's Open Source Center, among other high-level roles that George has had in the U.S. government. He joins us now to analyze the ceasefire and the likelihood of it being accepted by Russia. George, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So obviously, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and NSA Michael Waltz were able to secure a deal with their Ukrainian counterparts that they sent over to Russia. And we don't know what's going to happen. It's hard to say what's going to happen. But as somebody who's studied this very closely and lived these sort of diplomatic conversations very closely, what do you expect how do you expect Russia will react to the deal that they secured?
Well, I think the Russians have several interests here that they're going to have to balance. One is I don't think they want to signal to the United States, to Europe, and to the world that they are the obstacle to ending this war. So I think they're going to try to show that they're willing to engage in good faith to pursue a settlement. So that's interest number one. Interest number two is they've got to assume that whatever ceasefire takes hold will be the future separation line between Russian and Ukrainian forces. I doubt they're going to want that line of separation to run through universally recognized Russian Federation territory in Kursk. So my guess is that they're not going to implement any kind of ceasefire deal until they have successfully expelled Ukrainian forces from the Kursk region. Now, that could well be, hours or days, the way things are going on the battlefield right now. So the Russians may not have to stall for very long when it comes to that part of this settlement process. I think the third thing, though, is going to be a serious part of all of this. The major leverage that the Russians have to ensure that Ukraine will not be a part of NATO and NATO will not be inside of Ukraine is continuing to fight this war. So before they agree to stop the fighting, I think they're going to want to have some serious assurances that the United States in particular is willing to recognize that Russian interest, that we are willing to give a very serious assurance in the form of a framework for further negotiations that recognizes that Ukraine will have to be militarily neutral, that it will not be a part of the NATO alliance, and that recognizes that the United States and NATO are not going to put NATO or American forces on Ukrainian soil. If the Russians can get that kind of an assurance, then I think we'll have the basis for moving forward here. So I think that's going to be something very much under discussion in Moscow and then between Moscow and American officials on this.
Can you actually explain a little bit more what you mean about Kursk? Because some people, I mean, this war has had so many different phases that it's easy to forget what happened in Kursk, actually, if you're following it just sort of more casually than you are, George, because this is a significant point of leverage now that a potential ceasefire is on the table. So how does Kursk factor into some of these conversations? And when you said this could change in a matter of hours or days, based on what's happening on the battlefield, could you tell us a little bit more about that too?
Right. Well, the Ukrainians launched an invasion into Russian Federation territory. For much of this war, they've been fighting a defensive battle against Russia's incursion into Ukraine. But Zelensky and the Ukrainian general staff made the decision to invade Russia itself in the Kursk region, taking advantage of a fairly lightly defended part of the Russia-Ukraine border. And they made some significant progress advancing into Kursk. I think the ultimate intention was to seize control of the Kursk nuclear power plant, which, had the Ukrainians succeeded in doing so, would have been a very serious bargaining chip to use with the Russians to try to strike a favorable settlement deal between Russia and Ukraine. But the Ukrainians pretty quickly failed to reach that objective. Their invasion bogged down, and the Russians more or less contained it. Now, since that incursion took place, the Russians did not appear to be in a hurry to expel Ukrainian invasion forces from Russian territory. Now, there are two ways you could interpret that. One is that the Russians did not have the wherewithal militarily to fight on the offensive on Ukrainian territory and expel the Ukrainians from Russian territory at the same time. So they set a priority of focusing on their advances in the Donbass region. The other way of explaining it, which is the one that I tend to favor, is that the Russians were content to use the Kursk region as a killing field, more or less. They allowed this incursion to continue so long as the Ukrainians were willing to keep feeding it with more and more men and more weapons that the Russians could in turn destroy, and that had an effect of further advancing this war of attrition that the Russians have been in with Ukraine. And I think one of the signs that the Russians think they're getting toward an end game in this war is that they have stepped on the accelerator in recent weeks in Kursk, trying to wrap up this Ukrainian invasion, drive Ukrainian forces back into Ukraine or capture them altogether. A lot of people have thought that this was a sign that the Russians are going on the offensive generally and have no intention of settling this war. I think it's just the opposite. I think the fact that they're now moving with such rapidity to drive the Ukrainians out of Kursk is a sign that the Russians think they're close to being ready for some kind of settlement, and they want the Ukrainians off of Russian territory before they agree to some sort of ceasefire.
That is really, really interesting. And Steve Witkoff, we know, is sort of being he's assigned to the negotiating role with Vladimir Putin, at least as of now. It seems like there may be some signs that they're telegraphing to the press, that the U.S. is telegraphing to the press. They don't know if the meeting will actually happen, but that's maybe just my interpretation of it, George. But how do you look at Witkoff, who negotiated that first phase of the ceasefire in Gaza, who got Mark Fogel released from Russia? He's a real estate guy without a lot of experience, but maybe that's been helpful for him as a sort of unorthodox business negotiator to come into some of these foreign conversations. How do you think he'll approach this with Putin?
Well, Putin is the key decision maker on this, and somebody needs to be able to engage with Putin that has President Trump's ear and has his trust, who can confidently speak on behalf of the president in representing U.S. positions to Putin. And I think Witkoff is in a very good position to do exactly that. Part of what we're seeing at this point is an exercise in ascertaining where the Russians are coming from, And the Russians are attempting to ascertain how serious the United States is about addressing what they call the root causes of the war in Ukraine, which really is code for Russia's belief that NATO's eastward enlargement and its intent to make Ukraine one day a part of the alliance is at the heart of the conflict that we see playing out in Ukraine today. And they want to address that bigger issue as part of a settlement. They're feeling out whether the United States is in fact willing to do that. And I think Witkoff is in an excellent position to convey directly to Putin President Trump's willingness to engage on that issue. Now, I don't think that the United States is going to codify any concessions about NATO membership and NATO expansion absent some Russian concessions. Now, we have to signal that we're willing to address the topic. We have to signal that we're willing to close the door on NATO's eastward expansion. But to make that formal, I think the Russians are going to have to agree to do some very serious things in return, one of which I think is to codify their support for Ukraine's membership in the European Union at some point. If the Russians are willing to do that, then my guess is we will probably have a basis for moving forward in a settlement process. And I think that's going to be one of the things that is going to be an intense subject of discussion between Witkoff and Putin, and between other Trump administration officials and Russian government officials going forward.
And now this is the million-dollar question, of course, but how likely is that in your estimation, George?
Well, I think there's a pretty good chance of this, quite honestly. I think it's clear that the strategy that Ukraine and the West have pursued for some 3 years prior to Trump's inauguration, one of attempting to defeat the Russians on the battlefield and supplement that with as much political and economic pressure as possible, all designed either to win the war outright or to force the Russians to capitulate without making any compromises on the side of Ukraine or the West. That has failed, and there's no reason to believe that it can succeed if we continue to pursue it. So there are very strong reasons for the West and for Ukraine to find a compromise going forward on this. But the Russians also have reasons to want to compromise. This war has been very bloody, very costly, both in terms of men and money, but also in terms of Russia's own geopolitical position. They are in a position where they find themselves very much dependent on China. They don't have any relationship to speak of with the United States and Europe, with the West. And that greatly constrains their geopolitical room for maneuver in the world. But on top of that, even if they were to win the war in Ukraine outright, which I don't think they can do, I don't think they can capture all of Ukrainian territory and govern it and occupy it over time. But even if they were able to do that, they would still face very serious military threats from the United States, from NATO, that they really can't do anything about just by winning the war in Ukraine. They would still face a much larger NATO alliance that greatly outnumbers them, that has technological superiority over Russia. They would still face American missile forces in Europe that could only expand in their deployments, that they really can't neutralize through military means alone. Those are all reasons that the Russians have to try to seek some sort of compromise deal with the West. Now, what has been standing in the way in part has been our unwillingness really to address those issues with the Russians on the one hand, but Russia's deep skepticism on the other hand, that we have any interest ever in talking about them. And Trump has changed that. He has signaled to the Russians that we're willing to talk about those things. So now the Russians have to make some decisions. Are they willing to engage seriously? And that in part is a question of trust building. And I think that's some of what's been going on between Trump officials and Russian officials in the last few weeks.
Okay, that's interesting as well. And I want to look back on that Oval Office blow up, after which there was much hand wringing, and now that we have some distance in the rearview mirror and a joint statement released by Ukraine and the United States on Tuesday about the ceasefire proposal that they had sent over to the Russians. George, now that, again, we have some distance from it, we have a proposal, how should we assess Donald Trump's tactics and Zelensky's tactics? Since they've eventually at least got together and agreed on, for example, at least the framework of the mineral deal and, got together on this proposal?
Well, I think there was a very serious divergence of opinions between the Trump administration and Zelensky over how to proceed on this war. I think Zelensky and most of Europe believe that the only way out of this war is to win it, either outright on the battlefield or to force Russian capitulation at the negotiating table. And in turn, their belief is the only way you win it is for the United States to get much more directly involved, either through active fighting on the battlefield or by injecting itself into this situation by offering an Article 5 style security guarantee to Ukraine. The Trump administration, on the one hand, feels that that kind of approach is a recipe either for failure or for direct conflict between the United States and Russia, neither of which it wants to risk. So their approach to this is to say there has to be a compromise because we've been in an escalatory spiral with Russia for a long time that is only going to get worse unless there is diplomacy to find a compromise that addresses Ukraine's core interests, American and European core interests, but also respects what Russia sees as its own vital interests in all of that. What we're trying to do is find out whether there's a sweet spot there. But in the Oval Office, you saw these two views clash directly. The Trump administration had asked Zelensky to come to that meeting wearing a business suit, which would have been symbolically quite powerful. It would have signaled that he is ready to move from war fighting to peacemaking. But he chose not to do that. He chose to wear military garb, more or less, and signal that he did not think at that time that the time for fighting was over. And he thought he could appeal above Trump, go to American public opinion, appeal to mainstream American media, and bring pressure on Trump to capitulate to Zelensky's preferred approach on all of this. Now, why did he think he could do that? I think the big reason why he thought he could do it is because he did it with Biden consistently for years and it always worked. So he went to that tactic again in the Oval Office and discovered that not only did it not work, it was quite counterproductive. Not only did President Trump and Vice President Vance push back on camera quite forcefully, but the United States followed that up by saying, if you want to fight this on your own without the United States, why don't you try that for a while and see how that goes? And we did cut off intelligence support, without which the Ukrainians are going to be very hard pressed to continue to prosecute this war. The weapons that they have been relying on from the West to fight Russia almost all depend on the provision of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance data that only the United States can provide. Europe can't substitute for that. Can Europe send some artillery shells, some fighter aircraft, some tanks? Yes. Can it provide the data on which Ukraine depends to fight back against the Russians? No, they can't. And I think what the United States did in the aftermath of that White House meeting was to show Ukraine not only that they're dependent on this support, but that the United States is not simply going to offer it because the Ukrainians demand it. That the path forward is going to be the path of diplomacy. And that has succeeded, I think. I think what happened in Saudi Arabia in the last couple of days is that having shown the Ukrainians that we are not going to be coerced into continuing the course that the Biden administration pursued, that the only alternative that the Ukrainians have going forward is through diplomatic negotiations. And I think we saw yesterday that the Ukrainians have admitted that that is the best path under the circumstances.
Yeah, and I suppose there's also a good case based on what you were saying earlier that Donald Trump's unwillingness to be sort of, I mean, this is going to sound very pejorative, but kind of bossed around by Zelensky or played by Zelensky in the same way that, Joe Biden at one point felt, according to a report in NBC News, that Zelensky was trying to call the shots and was insufficiently grateful. So Trump's sort of public willingness to make that case, I guess there's also an argument that shows Russia he's a different type of president who's actually also more serious. If Russia needs to know the U.S. is serious about this peace process, I suppose there's an argument, George, I'm curious what you think, that Trump's willingness to engage with Zelensky in that meeting and J.D. Vance's willingness to engage with Zelensky in that meeting may help their case now trying to prove to Russia they're serious.
Well, right. Part of what the Russians are trying to assess is not just is Trump serious in his intentions toward trying to settle this war. They're also looking to whether he has the political juice, so to speak, to bring the rest of Washington around to this conclusion too. And during Trump's first term, I think the Russians had grave doubts that Trump could actually deliver the Washington foreign policy establishment to some sort of new approach to dealing with Russia. So they've been watching very carefully. Can Trump bring Washington along with him and line up the bureaucracy, the media, Capitol Hill behind a compromise settlement and all of this? So that was one of the things they were looking for in that Oval Office meeting. And my guess is that in retrospect, over the past week, I think they have grown more confident that Trump has sufficient clout to do this. Now, this is going to be something they're going to continue to watch very carefully. So they're going to look at what's happening on Capitol Hill. They're going to look at media. They're going to look at American public opinion polls and try to ascertain how durable, how solid is the support for the kind of deal that Trump is trying to put together here.
Yeah, and George, my last question is just your background is intelligence. I have to imagine, I mean, you know this region inside and out, and I have to imagine it's been somewhat surreal to watch. Quincy, for example, has hosted J.D. Vance for speeches before. It has to be sort of surreal to watch this administration truly upend the foreign policy conventions and orthodoxies of Washington, D.C. So I'm just curious for your kind of perspective as somebody who's been doing this work for a long time and knows this area so well, what it's been like to watch all of this play out over the last couple of weeks.
Well, first of all, it was very surreal to see old orthodoxies that were rather deeply rooted during the Cold War, uprooted during the post-Cold War period, and American foreign policy change in ways that would have seemed very odd back in the 1970s and 1980s. A foreign policy that was almost eager to get involved in foreign military conflicts, and B, was quite dismissive of what I would call traditional diplomacy, and instead viewed foreign policy as essentially a transformational endeavor, a belief that the United States could only be secure when we changed other countries so that they were a lot more like the United States. And that failed, I think. So what I think Trump and Vice President Vance and others are saying is what they're doing right now is not unorthodox. It actually is a return to an approach to foreign policy and an approach to diplomacy that is much more traditional and time-tested than what we've been doing for the bulk of the post-Cold War period. Now, does Trump have his own unique style in applying this? Absolutely. There's no question about that. I think he'd be the first person to acknowledge that. But the effort to balance power, to use diplomacy, to balance interests among great powers in the world, to try to make sure that these interests don't come into conflict, and to use a combination of peace through strength, which of course is a very time-tested approach to things, and sensible diplomacy, that's actually quite normal for all of this. And when you get over your focus on Trump's own unique style, his rhetoric, and all of this, I think there is a very recognizable traditional approach to diplomacy that the Trump administration is applying here. So it has been fascinating to watch. It was fascinating to watch the changes that occurred in American foreign policy after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after 9/11 in the United States. And it's also been quite interesting to watch the Trump administration say out loud what a lot of people know but haven't been willing to say, which is that our approach to the world is failing. If we continue to seek primacy, if we continue to believe that American security depends on American hegemony in the world, and that it depends on trying to change other countries in the way they conduct their internal affairs.
So interesting. George, thank you so much for taking the time to talk us through these complicated developments. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's edition of Undercurrents. It was a pleasure to have George on the show. He's so interesting and his insights are so valuable, especially given his decades of experience in the space. Reminder that you can have a premium subscription to Undercurrents over at undercurrents.tv. It's just $1 if you want to try it for a month. You get special premium episodes of the show for subscribers only, an email address to communicate with us, and a weekly newsletter from me. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you download your podcasts, and we'll be back with more Undercurrents soon.